Today, in a Democracy Now! Exclusive, we spend the hour looking at a story of yet another whistleblower imprisoned under the Obama administration, a story that could be straight out of a Hollywood thriller. The saga centers on an American businessman and philanthropist who was caught in an amazing web of international white-collar crime and mysterious, suspected double agents of powerful intelligence agencies. A man who, when he blew the whistle, ended up being indicted by federal prosecutors, convicted and sent to prison for violating the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. The cast of unlikely characters includes a man nicknamed the Pirate of Prague, a former U.S. senator, an Ivy League university, and the presidents of the former Soviet Republic of Azerbaijan.
The story centers on a multimillionaire named Frederick Bourke, known as Rick. You might recognize the name. He's best known for co-founding the luxury handbag company Dooney & Bourke. Using profits from the handbag company, he later became a major investor in medical research, including cutting-edge cancer treatments. Today, Rick Bourke is locked up at Englewood, a minimum security facility in the suburbs of Denver, Colorado, after he was convicted in U.S. federal court in 2009 of conspiring to pay bribes to government leaders in Azerbaijan as part of a risky scheme to buy the state oil company in the former Soviet Republic. Bourke is serving a sentence of 1 year and 1 day after he unsuccessfully appealed his conviction. In addition, he was ordered to pay a $1 million fine and serve 3 years of supervised release following the prison term. Prosecutors never alleged Bourke had actually paid bribes, only that he knew of the bribes paid to the Azerbaijani officials.
Azerbaijan is a key U.S. ally in Central Asia. Located on the western shore of the Caspian Sea, the former Soviet Republic shares a border with Iran and is a key transit route for U.S. troops and supplies heading for Afghanistan. The country has been run by the same family since 1993. First by Heydar Aliyev and then his son Ilham. Ilham won re-election just last week after a controversial vote. Frederick Bourke was one of many prominent investors in the deal, but the only one who was jailed in the United States. Other investors included former Democratic Senate Majority Leader George Mitchell and major institutions including Columbia University and AIG. Bourke's supporters say he's a whistleblower who helped expose the shadowy underworld of global finance once he realized he was being swindled. High-ranking former U.S. and British officials from the CIA and MI6 have also raised serious concerns about the conviction of Bourke, in part because the key witnesses during his trials were alleged intelligence assets working for the U.S. government. They aren't the only ones who question Bourke's guilt. Even the judge in his case has admitted having doubts. At the time of Bourke's sentencing, Shira Scheindlin of the federal district court said, quote, "After 10 years of supervising this case, it is still not entirely clear to me whether Mr. Bourke was a victim or a crook or a little of both."
While Bourke remains in jail, the masterminds and key players behind the bribery scheme, the men he blew the whistle on, remain free. Victor Kozani, who is known as the Pirate of Prague, lives in a gated community in the Bahamas. Attorney Hans Bodmer serves on the board of a Swiss bank, and a third man, a U.S. citizen named Tom Farrell, lives in St. Petersburg, Russia, where he runs a bar. Bodmer and Farrell pleaded guilty and signed agreements to provide testimony in related cases. We recently spoke to Michael Tigar, the renowned attorney, law professor, and author who is representing Rick Bourke. We also spoke to Scott Armstrong, a journalist formerly with the Washington Post who's closely followed the case. He's founder and former executive director of the National Security Archives and former chairperson of the Government Accountability Project. I began by asking attorney Michael Tigar to lay out the story.
In 1998, in the spring, Rick Bourke invested, he and his family, $8 million in a plan formed by Victor Kozani, a Czech entrepreneur, for the privatization of the hydrocarbon industry of Azerbaijan. Kozani was a crook. He stole every bit of Rick Bourke's money and all of the other investors' money. He bribed Azeri officials. He lives today happily unextradited in the Bahamas. The scheme was put together by a Swiss lawyer named Hans Bodmer, who was given a no-jail plea by the United States government and who sits happily in Zurich today laundering money for Russian oligarchs, and by a fellow named Tom Farrell, who was the bagman who operates, an American citizen, operates happily, well, the Russians apparently like him, a bar in St. Petersburg. When Rick Bourke found out about the stealing in 1998, he went to the New York District Attorney's office and he appeared before a grand jury in the state of New York. They indicted Khazani for theft. Bourke then went to the federal government. They said, oh no, Khazani's not a thief. He might be guilty of some other offenses. They indicted Khazani for offenses for which, as a matter of fact, he couldn't be extradited. They could have extradited him on the theft charge. And instead, they indicted Bourke on the testimony of Bodmer and Farrell that Bourke had known about the bribery of Azeri officials. Testimony that perhaps in the course of this trial we can deconstruct, because it was ill-motivated. Today, Rick Bourke is in jail. I regard him as a whistleblower, and we were unsuccessful, even after a United States attorney stood in the United States Court of Appeals in Lower Manhattan and told the court that the United States Attorney's Office in this judicial district is perfectly happy to put on false testimony knowing that it's false, that it happens all the time, but that Rick Bourke isn't entitled to any relief on that basis.
I'd like to bring Scott Armstrong in, a former Washington Post reporter, founder of the National Security Archive, and for a time a chairman of the board of the Government Accountability Project. Scott, how did you get involved in this case, and what is the broader issue involved here of the case of Rick Bourke?
Well, after Bourke had been indicted, he was seeking to establish the fact that he was a whistleblower, and at one point went to the Government Accountability Project, a nonprofit organization which helps and protects the ability of whistleblowers to speak out. They turned to me and asked if I'd be interested in taking on this case, taking a look at what happened, and seeing if Bourke was a whistleblower. I should point out that I'm speaking today for myself and not on behalf of the Government Accountability Project, but that was my route in. I reluctantly accepted it because it seemed like an opportunity to look at a case of major international corruption, a case where there was massive fraud by Khazani, but also where there were a lot of other things going on. This fellow Hans Bodmer, who was the key witness against Bourke, was also the chief operating officer for not only Khazani, but for a whole variety of international crooks, for the Russian oligarchy and for many Russian officials, international criminal of the first order. And you don't get an opportunity to look into these matters unless you have some access to information which is normally not released by the government or sealed. And what Bourke did was he said he would give us access, total access, without any controls or restraints, to look at all the records that he had, all the information he had. We could ask anybody, waived his attorney-client privilege and so forth. So I took on the project and spent nearly 2 years, a year and a half, looking at what actually happened. What shocked me, and I think is what is important here, is that the government, the United States government, very deliberately ignored what happened. Their interest was not in what happened and finding out where this actually led, but in going after a relatively narrow cast of characters. They were in the process. They essentially interrupted a very effective investigation conducted by the New York District Attorney's Office, which had remarkably enough, by coincidence, a very competent attorney named Miriam Klipper, who went to the Czech Republic, where Khazani originally was, and began investigating, and was moving along with Czech investigators very rapidly, and ultimately indicted Khazani. In the meantime, the federal government was approached by Khazani, who himself was, because of Bourke's whistleblowing, was being sued by other investors in London and was losing the case badly. So Khazani took a remarkable strategy and came to the United States government through attorneys just at the change in administration, just as the Clinton administration was leaving and the Bush administration was arriving. And he essentially said, I'm outside your jurisdiction. You're never going to get me. But I am, in fact, involved in an international crime. But it's my investors who really led me to do it. And he then said, you can get the investors, you can't get me, and I'll cooperate with you, and began telling a story. And the principle there was that if he could establish the United States government interest in that fact, that they were all crooks, then in the London courts, where Khojaini stood to lose hundreds of millions of dollars, the courts couldn't rule in the favor of the investors, because the investors would be perceived to have unclean hands and could not recover their assets as a result. So it was a negotiating strategy, effectively, but it worked. And once the government began its investigation, the United States government began its investigation, it threw aside, it didn't cooperate with the New York State, the New York District Attorney's Office in their investigation, which was quite far advanced and quite complete, and included already an indictment for an extraditable offense. They threw all that aside and then began to bungle around and ended up focusing on the one person who was not, they couldn't explain his behavior because he was a whistleblower. And he had as soon as he had learned of Khojaini's corruption, he began blowing the whistle. Of course, Bourke had no idea that this actually went far beyond Azerbaijan, far beyond the Czech Republic, and involved a series of Russian oligarchs, Russian banks, Russian officials, and the third largest oil company in Russia, which was bought and sold and profited Khojaini in the middle of this. So this elaborate set of frauds that Khojaini was involved in were, in essence, covered up by the United States government, who chose instead to bring the full weight of their investigative enthusiasm against the whistleblower. And that, to me, that shocks the conscience.
That was Scott Armstrong, former Washington Post reporter, founder and former executive director of the National Security Archives and former chair of the Government Accountability Project. We also heard from renowned attorney, law professor, and author Michael Tigar, who's representing Frederick Bourke, who was convicted of violating the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act for alleged knowledge of bribery in pursuit of the privatization of the state oil company in Azerbaijan. After the break, we'll continue our conversation with Armstrong and Tigar about this complex case of international fraud, Caspian oil, competing foreign intelligence services, and why, among the cast of characters that includes Viktor Khojaini, the pirate of Prague, his bagman Thomas Farrell, alleged money laundering Swiss attorney Hans Bodmer, an American running a bar in St. Petersburg, Russia, the only one to go to prison in the United States was the whistleblower Rick Bourke. Stay with us.